Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. I want to start off today with a confession, which is that I full-time pay attention to the news, particularly domestic politics, particularly the Trump administration, cover it every day. I am having a hard time tracking the tariff story. Like, which one is on, which one is off, which one is paused? There's been this crazy cycle where Donald Trump announces some new tariff and out of seeming hurt feelings or spite or pettiness or just an undying rage at the people of Madagascar and the penguins on that random island. And then he comes back and says, we're pausing them, but then hikes some new ones and then maybe does some carve outs. And it's been very hard to track this story because in some ways, I think there are kind of three stories. There's the narrative story of Trump's attempting to unilaterally bully the world into kind of paying the U.S. a kind of tribute. He views us as a kind of mercantilist empire that people should pay us for the privilege of selling things to us, which is very weird. So there's sort of the story of how Trump's dealing with the tariffs. There's how financial markets have dealt with the on again, off again-ness. And then there's the real effects to the real economy, like people that actually have to use and import steel or lumber or drop ship products from China because that's part of their business model. And I feel like those three stories are proceeding on different tracks, but it'd be easy to lose sight of what's actually happening at the bottom layer of those stories. And one of my favorite podcasts, the Odd Lots podcast on Bloomberg with Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, they track this kind of thing. They're one of the best go-to sources to keep your finger on the pulse of what's actually happening, both in financial markets and in the real economy. And so I thought to try to get a little clarity in this very, very unclear, murky situation, I would have Joe Weisenthal from the Odd Lots podcast back on with Pod. Joe, how you doing?
It's been too long. I'm thrilled to be back here. I'm good. I'm loving covering the news these days.
Yeah, you're sort of in it right now. What do you think about that kind of tripartite distinction between this story, the Trump story of his negotiations, the financial markets reaction, and the actual real economy?
Yeah, actually, you put it better than I had. That was really good. Because I would have said, yeah, there's the story of the real economy, and then there's the story of the financial markets. But I also think there is this sort of distinct, and maybe you could call it political, maybe you could call it geopolitical. I'm not sure. There's this other story, which is just about Trump, the character, as he tries to negotiate in the world and establish himself, right, as the master negotiator, which he seems to see himself as a deals person. You know, it's always very funny to me because you have these, there are third parties or people out there, pundits, who are, people ask them, what do they think? And they don't know, and no one has any idea. And I think there's more uncertainty now than ever. But they're always like, well, he's a deal maker, right? The one thing we know about Trump, he's a deal maker. And I'm not really actually sure if that's true. There's definitely deal makers in the world. Many of them work at banks or private equity funds and so forth. I'm not really sure if Trump is a deal maker, but he certainly fashions himself as one. And he certainly sort of imagines, I think, that if you could just, talk to Xi Jinping and, figure out a deal or something like that. And I think it's sort of like important for him to do something like that, something that is deal-ish.
Yeah, I mean, it connects to this on the Trump part of it, right? It connects to this other story that's been sort of a funny story in the last week called the Trump taco trade, which is Trump always chickens out, which is basically financial markets betting that when he announces some new tariff, he's not going to see it through. And so if you buy the dip when people freak out, you'll do well because in the end, he's going to retreat. That to me is maybe a more honest assessment of him as deal maker. I mean, we sort of saw this the first time around with NAFTA. He railed against NAFTA. They renegotiated a deal that was not like some massive substantive difference.
Yeah, it wasn't a radical departure at all.
Right.
What's happening is people are paying less and less attention to each one each headline for precisely the dynamic you've described. People think it would be degraded. The steel tariffs change all the time. What's going on with China? There are headlines every day that would have been a huge deal in the middle of April that today in early June, people are like, oh, and they just sort of look up for their screen and that's that. The one thing I will say, though, that I think is important, like people, yes, have been conditioned to think that, you just buy the dip, right? Because the markets will have this forcing mechanism, and he'll go back, and that's probably true. This is also the case for decades of U.S. history, right? Just
Yeah.
pray for real. Like, I really think this is important, which is that actually betting on the demise of the U.S. has been this terrible trade for decade after decade after
Yeah.
decade. And that, yes, there's this sort of Pavlovian thing where traders have sort of been conditioned to you always buy the dip for good reason. It always seems to work. And so far, there is nothing that has emerged that says that is going to change soon, which I think is an important thing to recognize.
Meaning, like, right, is he capable? Does he either have the will or the ability to unilaterally destroy the American economy and its position of global hegemony?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, right, both of those questions, because if you actually think seriously like what he wants to do, like if you took the sort of like strong form Trump and you like all this sort of like very populist idea and, this like, oh, capital M manufacturing, and we really don't want to rely on others because relying on others is always zero sum, et cetera. I think that would be terrible for corporate profitability if you really took all these things very seriously, and that would be very bad for, the stock market, which is largely driven by the long-term trends and profitability of the biggest companies in the United States, which are the biggest companies in the world. But the flip side is like, A, does he really want to do that? B, there are a lot of forces conspiring against that from happening. C, it's like short-term painful. And D, it might just be really hard to slow the juggernaut of the U.S. corporate sector, which is global, which is incredibly powerful, which is driven really increasingly by a handful of unbelievably profitable, rapid-growing, gigantic corporations, largely in tech. And so, there is to some extent this incredible force, these giant companies that we all know the names of, the Metas, the Googles, the Nvidias of the world, hoovering up every last dollar of profitability that there is. And it's really hard to derail, even if you want to. And I'm not sure anyone wants to.
Well, the thing you just mentioned there about what is his preferred end state, I think is worth taking a second with. Because I actually do think one of the things I think that makes this different than other areas of Trump policy, like for instance, if you look at the big, beautiful bill.
Yeah.
We're all going to die bill, as Chuck Schumer just called it. He doesn't care about hardly anything he has no fixed ideological commitments. I mean, he just doesn't. It's been a huge advantage to him how transactional he can be, because he just doesn't, like other people in politics, genuinely care about, do more people get Medicaid or not? Are we cutting spending or increasing it? Trump doesn't care at all. He has no fixed ideological commitments on this. He wants to see his rhetorical promises delivered, like no taxes on tips. But other than that, he doesn't care. On trade, he cares. Like, he has a genuine worldview and ideological commitment. And I think, honestly, you mentioned this, but I think it's worth taking a second. Like, there's this term autarky, which refers to a fully self-sufficient economy in which there is no external trade. Everything is produced domestically. And I kind of think he thinks that's the best way to run an economy. Like, if he had his druthers, that's what he wants.
Yeah, I kind of think you're right. I think there's actually two things, which is, I think you're absolutely right, that he has this sort of deep intuition that international trade is a loss for the United States. And it's interesting the way he talks about American trading partners. Because if you notice, and I believe him when he says it, because he's consistent and it sort of fits, he never seems to hold it against the other country, even though he says, like, we're getting these terrible deals from Canada. We're getting these terrible deals from China. And then he says, oh, if I were Xi Jinping, I would have done the same thing. If I were Justin Trudeau, I would have done the same thing. So he doesn't seem to really hold it against these countries, but he does seem to think that, he mainly blames past leadership. So he has this deep intuition, I think, that trade is kind of a loss. On the other hand, I think there's part of him too, and this maybe gets back to his self-conception of a deal maker. What is a win for him? Maybe it's just something that there is an end state where there is something called a tariff in the world. That, okay, maybe it's 10% or whatever, and that's not enough probably to like kill international trade. But maybe from his perspective in terms of like, what does a policy W look like? Maybe it's just that the existence on a sustained basis of something that looks protectionist. Because I don't think, even if he does not really believe in the premise of international trade is a good thing, I don't get the impression that he has the political appetite to actually like kill it, which he, on April 2nd when he announced that tariff schedule, it's like, oh, he's just going to kill trade. Like that's unplugging the international trading system. That rolled back pretty quickly. Doesn't really look like he has the appetite to actually do that, even if that is what his intuition is. But I do think he wants there to be something in the world. I think he wants tariffs to exist on some level.
Yeah, and he wants them higher, and that gets us to a sort of the third part of the story, right? So there's his back and forth. There's the markets kind of at first thinking he's full of it, and then being like, oh my God, he's serious, and now increasingly thinking he's full of it, right? So the big sell-offs there's fewer and fewer of them.
Yeah. And the sensitivity, the market, right, in both directions just does not respond to headlines about tariffs the way it would have in April, because I guess everyone just sort of figures we'll get this mediocre, this middle state of something but nothing major. And I think, I've increasingly gone down the mental path of thinking in recent history, Brexit is probably the analogy, which is like this immediate shock. And then does it overnight like eviscerate the UK economy? No. But is it great? No, it's just sort of you get this. It's just less good than it probably otherwise would have.
I think Brexit is. I'm glad you brought up Brexit, because Brexit to me is such a perfect example. It's also a little like Italy under Berlusconi, where it's like it's not a cataclysm, but it definitely makes everything just worse. I mean, that economy has been hurt by Brexit. Things are grinding along. The country has lost tremendous ground. If you look at its growth projections, where it should be and where it is, its politics have gotten even crazier post-Brexit, interestingly. The Brexiteers won the policy victory. Majorities of folks in the UK say it was a mistake, and yet the Reform Party is like on the rise, which makes no sense when you put it all together. The Brexit example is great because to me, it's sort of unsatisfyingly undramatic. It's just everything is a little shittier.
I think the cost of doing business in the United States is going to go up on account of tariffs. And is that the end of the world? I don't think so. And the market, you look at the market, it doesn't think so. That's why we stopped that spiral that was happening in April. The data since then, the way I've been seeing it lately is the data falling off a cliff? Definitely not. Is there deceleration? I think so. Probably it's the type of deceleration that the Fed could cut rates and probably lean against in some way. But I think it's just, it's a I think that people see the cost of doing business in the United States has gone up. It would be a less dynamic economy. I think there are other factors that are probably driving that. Some of the policy uncertainty around fiscal, some of the cuts to science spending, and so forth. These are all things that when you sort of add them together, like none of them are instant cataclysm, but none of them would seem to make it a more robust, a more prosperous economy per se, or even necessarily a safer, more secure economy either. It's just it seems like the addition of these things is like it's just not going to be as strong.
I mean, one thing that's happened here is this sort of, Kahneman and Tversky, the famous cognitive scientists, talk about the anchoring effect, right? So, if someone says, I've got a house to sell you for $10 million, and you're like, I can't afford a $10 million house. And then they're like, I'm cutting it 90% to $1 million. And you're like, oh my God, that sounds like an amazing deal. But it turns out the house is only worth $300,000, right? Yeah. And you're like, You've anchored on the value at 10, you've come down to 1 million, but like, it's actually still not a good deal at 1 million, right? This is happening with the tariffs. Like we have 30% tariffs on China. We have a 10% moat around the country. We have the highest tariff level since Smoot-Hawley. Like the actual, even after all the up and down, the tariff level in the US, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is much higher than it's been since the 1930s.
It's a fact, and it's very high, and it's at protectionist levels, and this is real. Now, there's a few things that are sort of notable here, which is that, the U.S. is a gigantic economy in its own right. It has a gigantic, complex domestic economy that to some extent is more autarkic than many other countries. In terms of,
that's interesting.
We grow a lot. We have a lot of fuel and oil and gas in this country. We have a lot of grain and cattle and fruit and stuff like that. We have a lot of pretty decent manufacturing in this country, both like automobiles and planes and semiconductors. Are we at the cutting edge? Are we where we want to be with some of this stuff? Clearly not, right? But when you just look, like we have an extraordinary mix internally. So, like, could you actually do autarky in the United States to some extent? Yeah, probably actually, yes. Like, if there's a country in the world
Right.
that could probably do it, like really seal it off, I think we'd be a much poorer country in if we really went for that. But
Definitely.
could we? Yeah, I think we would take
You're
like a
right.
material hit.
We've got
We
a
would
better shot than Belgium.
absolutely,
Right. That's the
absolutely.
point.
We
Is
have
like you got to
everything. I think
remember.
this is really important.
Yeah.
And you said it in the beginning, like it is true. I think to some extent that there are probably this premise of like paying for the privilege to sell into the United States. I don't 100% dispute the premise across the board.
Right.
So it's interesting. Like, this week, there were earnings from Dollar General, which you'd think is like one of these companies that would, my co-host Tracy wrote about this. You'd think it was one of these companies that, they're like right in the crosshairs of tariffs, right? Because you walk into one of those stores, or like a Five Below is another one, which I just went into. I just went into my first Five Below this weekend. My kids loved it. But it's just shelves and shelves of the cheapest junk in the world. It's not junk, but you know what I'm
made
saying.
not here.
Made not here, the vast majority of it. And yet, the shelves are all still completely full. And if you read the Dollar General earnings, they have actually been able to exact some cost concessions from their international suppliers, in part because there is not another United States out there. There's nowhere close. We're so rich in this country. We have so much buying power. So the idea of like, okay, we're going to like force other countries to like eat some margin, or other suppliers, there are going to be instances where that doesn't work. There are going to be cards, China has the rare earths, other things like that. But is it like always completely crazy that companies would eat some margin so that they can have some access to the United States? No, it's actually not crazy at all. So you add up that reality, and then you add up the fact that like we really are endowed by an extraordinary amount of sort of real resources and wealth within our borders. And you could sort of see why, like, even with the fact that we have the highest tariffs since, say, the 1930s or whatever exact year it is, why it is not cataclysm automatically.
But then there's a question of like, okay, it's not cataclysm.
But what do we get for it?
Right.
Anyway,
This is really
Yeah.
important, because it's like, right, like the Brexit example I think is good. It's not cataclysm. Still a very wealthy country. You still go to a pub and
Yeah.
you can like have a
That's
great time in London.
I was in London in April. Great city.
Yeah, and it's not like you're not like, oh my God, it's unrecognizable. It's like
Yeah.
it's the same country. It's just it's a little poorer for sure. Now, then the question becomes, okay, well, what do you get for it? And this
do
to
you
me
get
is
for it?
also part of what has been so weird and maddening about this. I mean, do you feel like you have an understanding of what is the, like, okay, it's not autarky.
Yeah.
It's some version of the 1950s, but not really. The joke I always make is that like they want the 1890s, not the 1950s. And the reason I say that is because Donald Trump keeps saying that all the time. He's quite clear that the 1890s were like, the high point.
Yeah. I gotta go back. If I close my eyes and envision America of the 1890s, I actually don't have like a sort of typical picture. The 1950s I do. It's like some like white picket fence and
Right.
all that stuff. I don't have I need to work on my 1890s visualization. Anyway, keep going.
Well, the 1890s is like peak Gilded Age, right? So
Yeah.
it's peak industrialization, urbanization, huge amounts of immigration that are
Yeah.
sort of starting to take off, enormous inequality,
Yeah. Were there any like was there any
enormous
like,
corruption.
was there like a middle class in the
No,
1890s?
There's
I
not
wouldn't have
really a
thought so.
middle
Yeah,
class.
yeah.
I mean, this is
Yeah.
sort of the thing. Like the reason I bring this up is when Howard Lutnick says your children and your children and your grandchildren are going to work in the same factory.
Yeah.
I'm like, what does that even mean?
Right. It's weird. It's weird. I mean, it's very strange. And I think like what do we really get out of any of this is, to my mind, one of the huge unanswered questions. Because, look, at least with like, arguably under Trump 1, and then certainly like under the Biden administration, regardless of whether these things were well executed, not or whatever, I had some sense that there were a few clear strategy goals with regards to how we were thinking of trade, right? We want to have some sort of battery industry, right, in this
Yep.
country because so many things are going to be electric. All right, that makes sense. We want to have some sort of greater capacity to manufacture advanced semiconductors because for reasons that we all know and lessons we learned in the pandemic. And there's also elements of, probably lessening inequality
Yep.
and the fact that we don't necessarily want to have an economy in which all of like the physical work is sort of done overseas. There's some like various. I get that. Like
And
all of
high
these
wage,
things, I like.
high
Yeah.
wage middle class jobs for non-college
Yeah, right.
people without
Which
college
really
degrees.
seem, and I do think like that specific point is very load bearing, which is that people really want there to exist a comfortable lifestyle for people who didn't go to
Yes,
college. And I think there's a lot of frustration that that doesn't seem
totally.
to exist. And college is extremely expensive in this country. So you have to like put out this big upfront
Yep.
expense to have the shot at something that resembles a middle class lifestyle, that we call comfortable, strikes a lot of people on both sides of the aisle as being deeply perverse or deeply wrong, or a real sign of like structural degradation. That like even
Yep.
with a college degree, you're not guaranteed of anything, but you're certainly guaranteed of not getting it if you don't have a college degree and it's crazy expensive. You take out debt. It's not a good equilibrium, or a lot of people perceive that to be as such. And so part of it is like, can there exist an industry that employs a lot of people who didn't go to college, and yet those people can have something that we recognizably as a middle class existence? Clearly like a big goal, but how any of this actually gets us there, unclear.
Well, right. Okay, so take that next step, because with the Biden
Yeah.
administration, whether it was well implemented or not, and I think some of it was and some of it wasn't, that was the vision. Like, we want to,
Yeah.
for both national security reasons, macroeconomic stability reasons, right, on the
Yeah.
superconductors, and international competition reasons, as well as
Mhm.
inequality. We want to sort of regrow a domestic industrial manufacturing base focused on the industries of the future,
Yeah.
such that we build more factories, we have more jobs, and on that front it worked. Like, manufacturing construction
The-
went through the roof.
That's correct. And at times, like even on April 2nd, even Trump specifically cited semiconductors. He even on the day where the blanket tariffs on everyone, he's like, oh, we're gonna have the greatest. I forget the exact line, but we're gonna have beautiful semiconductor factories in the United States. Even as the administration, as far as I can tell, has dramatically pulled back
Yes.
all of its interest in the bipartisan CHIPS Act that was signed under Biden. Now, I'm sure there are other ways. If you want to argue with me, the CHIPS Act itself, like, is not synonymous with chips, the industry. That we can foster a semiconductor industry in the United States, but really rethink the incentives, because the CHIPS Act wasn't it. Like, I'm totally
Sure.
fine with that.
Yeah.
But I don't know what that thing is under the current trade. I don't think anyone has seen like what the substitute is. And it's sort of weird too, because there is this whole like, tech right element, obviously, within the Trump coalition. And I don't know what they're getting yet from any of this.
Well, I have a theory on that, which I want to talk about. But to stay on this about like, okay, what's
Yeah.
the goal and how do you get there? Okay, at least in the case of the Biden administration, I was clear of the goal, and I was clear that these were the things they were trying to do: the Inflation Reduction Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, right? And there were some places where there were clear successes. There are some places where it was much more middling. I think there's some people who would say that some of the implementation was bad. Okay.
Mhm.
There is no path from A to B with Trump, which brings us back around to the narrative part of this, because the end state goal, if you are as charitable as possible, which is some 21st century version of the 1950s and 60s industrial manufacturing boom, right?
Yeah.
Middle class America, can only happen if there's constancy in the policy that they
I would
can't
think so,
do
yeah.
for like 5 days.
You know what the other, I mean, that's my intuition too. You know what the other thing I think is interesting is, you mentioned early on that, Trump himself does not seem to have any particularly strong ideological commitment. I do think, on the other hand, much of the congressional GOP does have pretty strong ideological commitments. And a pretty big one, I think, is the sort of disbelief in the premise of a robust public sector in any realm.
Yep.
Like the premise that the public sector could play a positive role in fostering a competitive private chips industry, et cetera. Some of these ideas, like, I think most, it does not look like most Republicans, certainly in the House, like really accept that premise,
Yeah.
that that's possible, which is, whatever. But that's very different. There's like, the idea that like the government could aim for something, could aim dollars at something, could put out a target at something and then create incentives for private industry to hit that.
Right.
I just don't think that's like something that Trump, even if that's, I do think Trump himself could be convinced, and there are probably people within the White House who actually do sort of buy that premise. It does not feel like the party has bought into that premise.
Right. But the weird thing about that is that tariffs is much more an imposition and a sort of tool of central planning than industrial policy passed by Congress. Like,
yeah,
like at least those there's a schedule, there's stability, there's constancy. People can, this is like the tariffs on China are 145%. No, they're 30%. No, they're back up to 50. Let's say, I mean, there was a Trump administration official a few weeks ago who was talking about like, we're going to make the dolls here in the US. You don't need so many dolls. I was like, all right, let's say that's the goal. We need more doll factories in America. Okay, I'm going to start a doll business. I'm going to start a doll factory. Like, well, the doll factory only pencils out if the tariff level from China is 60%.
Stays there forever. And so the moment you start that doll factory, you're going to become a pro. This is really important. The moment that you start that doll factory, you're going to be the #1 lobbyist on Capitol Hill for protectionist policies. And so it actually, like, you think about, this is really key. And any of these companies, I mean, even the big companies that like, all right, at some point, are big, you think like auto companies, et cetera. It's like at some point they may make bigger commitments to produce here. Or you look at what's going on with Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. And so you look at these like range of industrial commitments that may emerge. We're like, all right, we're going to do more here in the U.S. And then if they're going to break ground on these things, they better have some certainty that this is never going to change in their lifetimes, that this is not going to be reversed in 2028 with the next president. And look, I mean, it's probably not a crazy bet. I mean, look, Biden was a continuation. I mean, Trump started this whole thing, right? Prior to Trump won, there was not this sort of real bipartisan consensus, particularly on the China component. He really kicked that off. Biden,
I mean, I don't think he did intellectually, but I think politically,
Politically, okay, right. But politically, I mean, there was no real impulse to reverse any of that when Trump lost. I was a little surprised by that. Like in 2019, I still thought that there was a real possibility that whoever came into the White House in 2020, if it was a Democrat, would reverse the tariffs on China. It still seemed like a possibility. And clearly, not only did that not happen, but trade restrictions and export restrictions to China all expanded under Biden. So like now, the idea of like going back to, I don't know, 2005, 2015 environment, that's gone for like the foreseeable future, probably our lifetimes, right? But you could imagine that as these things persist, then they build their own momentum, and suddenly, one day it may be unimaginable that we don't have, minimum 10% tariffs on the UK and Canada and countries that for a long time we assumed were just like our most open trading partners.
Yeah, I mean, the point you just made there about the political economy of this, right? So if you do break ground on the factory, you're going to be the #1 lobbyist to keep the tariffs. I mean, this is literally the original insight of Adam Smith, right? Like the birth of market capitalism, as described by Smith and the Invisible Hand, is a polemic against mercantilism. And particularly the deadweight loss of mercantilism, how it makes everyone poorer, but also the political economy of it, right? To your point before of like, ideologically, it's hard for Republicans to get on board this industrial policy. I guess the point I'm making is this sort of tariff craziness with one man being the one who decides it creates all kinds of political economy rent-seeking perversions that I would argue are worse than passing a bill that at least is transparently written out that everyone can, look at.
So I would say a few things on this. One is, the Jones Act in DC gets a lot of attention. Nothing ever happens about it, but people like to debate it. It's this law that requires that if you're going to do U.S. to U.S. shipping, it has to be on a U.S. built and U.S. flagged vessel. So you can't move goods from Houston to New York unless it's on a U.S. vessel. Those don't really exist. So you just have this very tiny domestic shipbuilding industry. No one thinks it's really successful, quote, industrial policy. No one thinks it's invigorating at all. to the U.S. shipbuilding industry, which is almost non-existent, but there are a few Jones Act compliant companies out there. It's this big loss. And to just have this protectionist husk of an industry that doesn't
Exactly.
really exist. And that I think is like a pretty legitimate concern that like you just sort of get more Jones-ish elements. The one thing I'll say too, in terms of like, this tension of like, well, like, why is this better than doing something in a bill, right? Why are the tariffs better than? And I don't know the answer actually, but what I did notice was that in early April, when we first got the sort of maximum version of the tariffs announced, the only real like full defenders were like mostly like cultural conservatives. Like there weren't really many people that I saw like online or anywhere.
It was
who
pretty
were,
hard. It was a hard thing to
yeah, I
defend.
know. It's a hard. The only people who are like really willing to stick our neck out were people who like really sort of see contemporary U.S. society as fallen in some way, perverted in some way, and
Yeah.
like really like it has sort of turned back the clock in a very literal sense of like, no, the U.S. economy needs to be cleansed. It needs a hard reset of some sort. And if this is the pain, if we have to like go through the fire to be forged, then this is it. It feels to me like that is still perhaps some of the driving impulse and why you can have a sort of GOP that's comfortable with some tariffs, et cetera, because of at least some people within that in the party sort of having a worldview such as this. We really need to endure pain. We got to be cleansed of our wickedness in some way, and this is a path forward.
Well, right. I mean, that discourse around, I mean, I found it so striking to get to sort of go back around to what Silicon Valley's gotten. I want to talk
Yeah.
to you a little bit
Yeah.
about, and I'm using this I'm working on this essay right now that is sort of about this. So I don't want to sort of scoop myself on it, but Scott Bessent gave this speech, I think at the Economic Club of New York or Chicago, where he said this thing that was so striking to me, where it was like, there's more to life basically than cheap stuff from China. That was, I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah. He said that. Yeah.
And what was so striking to me is like, you and I are around the same age and cohort. I came up in sort of lefty media, particularly a socialist magazine in Chicago called In These Times. I covered trade fights, 1999 WTO. I was, still in college, but the aftermath of that, I wrote a profile of Sherrod Brown in 2005 when he was running for Senate. He was one of the lead critics of U.S.-China bilateral trade.
Yeah.
It's so wild to me that like the lefty critique of the neoliberal global trading order,
Yeah.
WTO, Naomi Klein, Sherrod Brown, blah, blah, has become a kind of consensus to the point where like Howard Lutnick and
Yeah.
Scott Bessent, who are like big Wall Street guys, are running around being like, why do you need all this cheap crap from China you buy at Walmart? And at some level, there's something to that. That was
Yeah.
a thing that we
Yeah,
said that people on the left said 30 years ago. There's more to life
Yeah.
than cheap
Totally.
crap from China and Walmart, like, for instance, vibrant downtowns run by mom and pop shops. But what's so crazy to me is they're saying all this about the failures of this consensus.
Yeah.
At the same time, everyone is winding up to do to college graduates and white collar folks with AI what trade
Yeah.
and globalization did to the blue collar.
Yeah.
Like,
No, it's
there's a
Yeah.
crazy mismatch of like, wow, we really got that wrong. 40 years of we've been kind of doing this the wrong way. We sure screwed up Youngstown and Gary, Indiana. And now it's like, what if we can make Marin County like Gary, Indiana, and we can make Park
Yeah.
Slope look like Youngstown? It's like, well, maybe that's going to go the same way, guys.
It's interesting, but for what it's worth, like, I mean, I certainly remember all of the left from, when I was in college and stuff, the left-wing critiques of international trade. But I lived in a co-op in when I went to college at UT Austin. And I just want to say, like, in our co-op in 2000 or 1999, we had a big sign on the kitchen about the dangers of seed oils
Oh,
and
yeah.
canola oil and
Totally.
stuff.
Yes,
and this was
absolutely.
like canon for like
Yep.
back then. You do not eat seed oils. And so, yes, this is one of these other topics that
Totally.
I've been hearing about for like 25
Yep.
years and now has traveled.
Well,
It now has
Let me
traveled
do
to
you
the
one.
right.
Let me
Yeah.
do you one better.
Yeah, we can play this game. Yeah, I'm down.
At that
Yeah.
time, also in the world that I went to, that I lived in, young lefty, you couldn't go to a single event where you didn't have the 9/11 truthers out and Bush knocked down the towers and controlled demolition of Building 7.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
now you've got the Republican senator, Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, on the Homeland Security Committee, basically saying Building 7 was controlled detonation.
Yeah.
This was like dorm room
Yeah.
radical
Well,
4 bong hits in stuff.
I'm not
that
going to
is-
like, I could go down. I would just say my last point on this very specific thing. Since I was in Austin, one of the frequent attendees at anti-rock war protests
Was
in
Alex
Austin
Jones.
was Alex Jones
Yeah.
on his bullhorn. So he was there. So
Yeah.
all of this is just, extraordinary full circle for guys like us.
Yes,
who have seen-
right.
yes.
So to be
Yeah.
in 2025, and it's like
Yeah.
Scott Bessent and the Wall Street guys are saying
Yeah.
the neoliberal global trade agenda was a mistake, and Ron Johnson's like, Building 7 was controlled detonation. It's like, Jesus
It's
Christ.
interesting. Like on this thing about like the way people are talking about AI, and like I really do not have strong. What do I know? I do not have strong views about the way AI is
neither.
going to develop and
Totally.
unfold, and
I'm totally
really,
open to being persuaded
Yeah,
in a
but
million directions. Yeah.
yeah, me too. But that and world trade, I think one thing is that like certain things are discussed with this is inevitability. This is like of course the world is globalizing. Of course we're going to have integration of the global economies. Of course you can no longer afford to do manufacturing in the United States. Of course labor is going to be cheaper elsewhere. Of course environmental regulations are going to be worse elsewhere. Of course AI is going to develop, etc. And I do think that all of these things, there is this discussion of like, yes, and that like, why are we having this debate? Or with the AI thing, with AI, certainly, it's like, you're sort of wasting your breath giving your opinion on it. It's going to unfold one way or another. And what either of us say on a podcast is almost certainly going to be irrelevant. But it is interesting that in 2025, what we were told was like, no, of course,
Exactly.
about the global economy, about trade. People are saying it did not necessarily have to be this way.
That really identifies part of what I think is
Yeah.
rubbing me the wrong way, is that yes, exactly at the same time that there's this sort of 180-degree sort of counter consensus that's formed. I mean, really, like a
Yeah.
counter consensus that says, no, we really made some missteps with this 30, 40-year project we underwent.
Yeah.
It had real costs. That this new discourse has arisen about the next step of the global economy, which has all the same kind of naturalistic fallacy sort of stuff about it, of like, this
Yeah.
just is the way it is. It's like complaining about the weather. Like it's out of our control. But it's like, well, wait a second. Why are like the fact that these two stand side by side, sometimes in the same
Yeah.
interview, like JD Vance, when he's interviewed, he's like Mr. Critique of neoliberalism in global trade. And then also Mr. like bullish on AI, don't worry about job loss. It's like, wait a second. These look very similar stories to me.
Deciphering the sort of discourse around AI in itself is super interesting because
of how
there's-
ideologically fraught it is.
it's so ideologically fraught, and it's so like understanding anyone's motivations for saying
Yes.
anything like you're right. So because look,
Totally,
like
yes.
you have like if you like
It's like
the-
a carnival.
There's- yeah.
It feels like everyone is talking their book.
everyone is, and
No one
Yeah,
has.
because-
Yeah.
well, if I have an AI startup, then I also have this desire to like say like, oh, it's going to disrupt the entire world, and
Right.
it's going to like result in the elimination of all white collar labor, which is simultaneous. It's like this weird Baptist and bootleggers type of phenomenon where they're working together on the same. So the AI doomers
Yes.
and the AI investors
Boomers,
are
yep.
actually talking the same book, because the common thread is like, well,
Yep.
I'm really worried this could be disruptive, but that really probably implies these companies are worth insane amounts of money. And so even the AI startups, they're all labs, like they're like OpenAI labs or whatever. Because it sort of gives this, we're doing a science project here. We're going to shroud it in some sort of corporate structure that is not a typical like startup thing. We're going to wrap it in a nonprofit because we got to keep it contained because it's sort of Manhattan Project. Like it's just all very strange. But I have to say, I actually, for real here, I genuinely like some of the comments that David Sachs of the All In podcast has been making, even though he shrouds them in like really intense, like ideological things where he talks like to Republicans, et cetera. He's like, don't repeat these Obama Axios talking points, these unproven arguments about how it's going to destroy the jobs because that's going to feed into regulation, et cetera. But I do actually appreciate it in the specific sense that he is presumably financially exposed and wants to see the AI industry boom, etc., but isn't talking about it as if the nuclear bomb is being developed, which really worries me. Like this idea, like the way people talk about
Yeah.
AI, especially geopolitically, it's like, oh, we have to beat China, right? There's this very like intense imperative. We must beat China to this technology that will confer as much power to its owner as the nuclear bomb did to countries as they developed it after World War II. And I sort of appreciate that even in this sort of like weird torqued way, that there are some voices talking about AI that's like, no, this is not pushing back. This is not
Right.
that existential, etc.
Right. Although I think he's talking his book there because he doesn't want to be regulated.
He doesn't want to be
Right.
regulated.
And
I agree.
so,
I totally agree.
and
I agree.
and
I
I would
agree
say
with this.
people
I
people
agree.
people that I've talked to who are very close to AI development, who I trust, right? These are people that I
Yeah.
know. I had someone say to me, like, look, imagine if we ran the nuclear arms race, but we just ran it through
Yeah.
a bunch of private companies.
Yeah.
Think how
Right.
insane that would be. What if there were like,
But yeah, I
and
know.
I don't, but again, my point here, and I think you and I are on the same wavelength on
Yeah.
this, which is depending on whatever the last article I read, I could be
Yeah.
convinced of everything from literally the world will be annihilated by an AI apocalypse before my children reach adulthood
2
to
years. Yeah.
the whole thing is absolutely a con job, is going to fall in on itself like web,
Yeah.
Web3,
No,
the metaverse. Like,
I'm jealous. Yeah, I'm jealous of people that have like formed a really strong opinion on this question because I certainly have not. But like, I don't know like who you talk to within the industry, but I do feel like people within the industry, they're like have been 6 months away from achieving AI for like the last or AGI for the last
Totally.
3 years, right? They see something in the lab, they're like, oh well, what we're seeing, it's really freaking us out. And we're really scared of like this stuff. I can't talk about it just yet, etc. I don't know.
but here's where these two stories to me, because these are
Yeah.
in some ways, these are sort of the two macroeconomic stories of Trump, right? There's
Yeah.
clearly this kind of rebellion against the neoliberal consensus,
Yeah.
push for mercantilism and autarky,
Yeah.
reestablishing tariffs and trade wars, right? With some, I think, sort of misguided notion of like some new version of the American factory worker, even though I don't think the
Yeah.
things he's doing are going to produce that. At the same time, that AI is going to, these people love AI. They use it to write all their reports. The AI people are giving them tons of money. They've got an AI czar who's very pro AI,
Yeah.
like yada, yada. The way that these to me combine is in the automation story, which is when you look at the data, I think a fair reading of the data is that automation has had a bigger effect on these jobs, the ones that you and I are talking about that people want there to be, going away as much, if not more than trade.
Yeah.
And like, there's a bunch of companies that want to automate all truck driving in America.
Yeah.
That's truck driving right now is a classic example of a pretty good paying job where you can have a
Yes.
decent middle class
Yes.
life with a high school diploma.
I think it's the most common job in every state
In
for
every
males
state.
without who don't have a high school diploma. Is that the most common job is truck driving? I've seen that stat a couple of places. Yeah, I mean, I think this is totally true. I think one of the things that's going on too is there's this view of AI as the final technology that has to be developed ever, right? Because once
Yes,
AI,
yes.
for real, because
Yes,
once
totally.
AI is developed, then I think there's this fantasy that all the other technologies become trivial to solve. That if you have something that is called AGI, well, then the AGI can solve self-driving trucks. Then the AGI can solve like the organization of the AGI can build robots. The
Right.
AGI can have therefore a robotic factory and everyone. So I do think like part of the weird thing about this moment and the AI obsession is this belief that almost nothing else is worth talking about, like all these other like science problems.
Climate,
like,
for
'cause I said,
instance, which
there
no
are
one
many- yeah.
one in that world seems interested in, even though it's a very
No.
pressing problem.
But yeah, that's exactly right. And there are like these various factions within the tech right that is interested in some other things in the world. And yet I get the impression that the way the circle is being squared and the fact that, look, they're cutting funding for science, et cetera. Well, why invest in human science, et cetera? Because after we have AGI, then that the AGI will make all these breakthroughs that currently humans in the lab are theoretically working on. And that is how you sort of like satisfy this
Right.
desire for progress with a capital P, the way many people who live in California and elsewhere are excited about, while at the same time, cutting investment in these areas.
Right. And when you come back to this sort of question of like, well, what does this new economy look like? I mean, I think this
Yeah.
sort of idea of 1890s is probably a useful one because
Mhm.
again, Trump says it himself, so like you might as well listen to
Yeah.
him. Like,
I'm a big fan of taking Trump literally, by the way.
yeah, on a lot of stuff I agree.
Yeah.
He has been very clear. He said this is when the US was at its richest.
Yeah.
But I think that the other thing I could come back to on when I think about sort of being on the other sides of these arguments, right? About
Mhm.
if we go back to trade, is at the same time that in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was in the trade skeptic ideological camp.
Yeah.
The pro-trade people would make this argument, which also had some real teeth to it, and which is true, which is this is a boon and windfall for working class people.
That's right.
Because all kinds of stuff that used to cost so much money has gotten so much cheaper.
Yeah.
And we had a period of basically 30 years of disinflation that
Yeah.
meant that like all these accoutrements of the modern household that used to be out of reach and you have to do layaway, like people could buy. And it actually created a huge welfare boon. And the reason I'm thinking about this is when I think about like China's BYD electric cars,
Yeah.
and I like look at them, I'm like, I want to buy one of those.
Yeah,
Like,
me too.
They
Me too.
have dope ass electric cars for like $20,000.
Yeah.
And you can't get them as an American.
No, it's crazy too. And I do think like the more I think about it, the more angry I feel about that. Like, well, I'm an American. I should be able to buy the best car in the world. Like it feels very wrong, and it feels like kind of ahistorical. This phenomenon, not a
I
historical in a
agree.
judgment way, but in a way that feels very unusual. Like it's an unusual
Like I can't
moment
buy.
in
What are you
American
telling me?
society.
I can't buy a BYD.
Yeah, that there's a car that exists that's better than anything on the market, and I'm not allowed to like purchase it is like really strange. I also agree, like, that like I would, when you go back to some of these comments are like, oh, the kids only need $2, or there's more to life than cheap goods from China. And there's a part of me like, is there? No, I don't mean it quite that extreme, but I do mean that like part of like modern like wealth and comfort, etc., like is connected to the fact that we can consume a lot of stuff at very low cost. And I also say, by the way, like I think there's one of my, if I were going to intervention in the abundance discourse, it's like, if this is what if what we have in the United States today is not abundance, like what is, right? Like people are talking about, we need abundance. I mean, oh my God, we're swimming in abundance. American, I understand that the media is heavily concentrated in New York and California, and so the vast majority of people who work in the media are unhappy with how much they pay for housing. But the actual, in reality, like the square footage of American households is gigantic. American households
It's
are
gone
swimming
up a crazy amount.
Yeah, so Americans are swimming in space. They're swimming in cheap stuff. Like, if this isn't abundance, I mean, come on.
Right, but the other thing is,
that's my contribution to that
well, but
discourse
the
these
thing I
days.
would say to that, and this is, I think, a really interesting place for this conversation to end up, because,
Yeah.
by all kinds of metrics, the American economy is this sort of little engine that could, not little,
Yeah.
big ass engine that could.
Yeah.
And it, there was a million predictions of recession during Biden, and they didn't happen.
That's right.
And it's outperformed every other economy in recovery. It outperformed a lot of economies in recovery from the Great Recession, even though it did
That's right.
poorly in many ways, but a lot of places did worse. It outperformed every other economy in the recovery from COVID. It does a lot of things when you look at the macro statistics and you compare it to other countries. It has a bunch of things going for it that continue to produce
Yes.
best in class results.
Correct.
And yet, Americans are, by all the measures we have, considerably less happy
Yeah.
than peer countries, and they die earlier.
Yeah.
And there's something to that as the fundamental paradox that we're solving for,
Yeah.
that we're using these tools of like trade or all these things where it's like, why is it the case?
Yeah.
And I think inequality has a huge amount to do with it, but it's both the case that we have the wealthiest, the best economy, and also the unhappiest citizens in our cohort who die the earliest. And that to me is the central contradiction of the country at this moment.
Yeah, I think you're right. And and when I talk about like, oh, Americans have gigantic houses and we have tons of stuff and multiple cars in our garages. The way I've been thinking about the American economy is
I mean,
not
lots of
only
people
is
don't. We should be clear. I just want to say because people
yeah,
will
no,
be
for
like,
sure. No,
"Screw
but
you,
that,
Joe." Like,
so I lots of people don't, but lots of people do. But what
right?
I
Yeah.
think is that lots of people do because there is a real ground down underclass
Yes.
in
Right.
American
Yes.
society.
Yeah. That's a
And
good point.
so that like a lot of people, like from a sort of purely material standpoint, like if you counted how big their yards are and how big their many bedrooms they had and how many cars they have, a lot of Americans have it well. But then there is this like layer underneath of people with
Yeah.
like deep poverty, deep like very little prospect of moving up. And then there's of course a country that's like riven with addiction and health inequality and other things that are like seriously detrimental, that driving down the terrible stats for things like you mentioned, like longevity, et cetera, worsening stats. And so what I think is that like there is this sort of like deep pathologies in American
Yes.
society that really are deep, that are not everyone, but like very concentrated, and everyone else is sort of has benefited from the existence of like this sort of ground down underclass.
And I think that to bring it back around, I think there's these sort of monomaniacal. I think Pete Navarro and to some extent Trump
Yeah.
and Stephen Miller think that the reason for this, to a certain extent, to the extent they have real views that you can credit as genuine views, is a kind of monomaniacal view that trade and immigration together are the reason for all this.
Right.
That it's trade, it's too much trade and too much immigration that has made the country a country where people are unhappy and alienated and pissed off, and this kind of underclass, and so there really is this, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail approach. To the extent there's a problem being solved for, and again, I'm crediting them more than I usually do, particularly the immigration, which I think is really, in the case of Stephen Miller, genuinely motivated by animus. But to the extent there's a non-animus motivated version of his views, that these two things are these are the source of the ennui and the problems and the lack of mobility at the bottom. And if you go at them, and I just think it's just a complete mismatch between what they're doing and what the solution is.
So I mean, I think actually that is a very good characterization of where of the views. The other thing I would say, look, we're seeing it right now with the attempt to pass the One Big Beautiful Bill. It's really hard to make policy in this country for various reasons. One of the things that happens to be true is that the executive branch has been delegated. Now the courts are fighting this, but there's one area of real policy where the executive branch does seem to have a lot of unilateral capacity, and that is tariffs. So it's actually beyond like everything. And immigration. So that's exactly right. So you say like, all right, if all you have is a hammer or everything, whatever the phrase, there is one area that like you don't actually have to deal with the tricky parts of capital P politics and allocating resources, et cetera, where the White House can just go on its own. And these are the two areas, trade and immigration. And so it's not particularly surprising that like they can't even, I mean, there's the Republican Party. It should be the most trivial thing in the world to extend a tax cut, right? That's like that's arguably what the big part of why the party's for. It's proving to be really difficult.
Well,
it'll probably happen, I would get, but
yes,
it's proving to be tricky.
On this last point, and I think this is actually really interesting because we've been talking about these weird sort of ideological inversions from 9/11 trutherism to anti-seed oil to trade. What's really interesting about that bill is that for all of these ideological inversions that have happened, that bill just could have been 2004 Republican Party, 2000. It is just, it has not, it exists out of time of all of these ideological trends. No, it's just George Bush, Mitt Romneyism.
So I would say two things, and I generally agree. So one thing is like, it is interesting, like watching Elon's specific arc, because a lot of people expected him as like, oh, he's going to bring techno thoughts to the government. And apparently he just got really freaked out about the size of the deficit and the debt. Like that's all he seems to care about DC wise. So that you really like, and I do think, I do think there is a slight, there's like two circles that overlap, but not perfect, which is this sort of like pro-business Republican Party, which I associate with like a Mitt Romney type or maybe a George W. Bush type, and then the sort of like anti-government type, and they're like slightly different, right?
They are.
They're
Yes.
slightly different impulses.
Yes.
And I think that like right now, like, and sometimes they could be mistaken for one
I agree.
another because both camps like lower taxes. But I think right now it's like the anti-government one is really the one that's in charge, and the sort of quote pro-business one, the chamber Republicans, whatever, doesn't still like it feels like they're kind of on the out still.
Yeah.
Even in the legislative realm.
Yeah. I don't know. I think they've done well. I guess I think they've done better in the legislative realm than in some other places. But we're going to see. It would be really interesting to see where this all goes. And by the time this hits your ear holes, maybe it's all moot because we've got some new tariff or everything's been
That's
reset.
the risk of our job these days.
Joe Weisenthal's co-host of the excellent Odd Lots podcast with Tracy Alloway. I really recommend it. It's great. Listen, Joe, great to have you back on.
Anytime, Chris. It's so great chatting with you again.